The sound of laughter reached me before I saw them. It spilled down the staircase like perfume and static, a kind of joy that had no place in mourning. By the time I reached the hallway, the scent of lilies from the funeral had already been replaced by champagne. Someone had turned on the chandelier, and its light scattered over the polished floor like the house itself was applauding the performance. I paused at the bottom step, my hand on the rail, my other hand gripping the edge of my sleeve to stop it from trembling. The dress I wore was still damp from the drizzle at the cemetery. My shoes left faint marks on the marble, dark spots that vanished as quickly as I appeared. They were all there already, gathered around the table, plates clinking, voices overlapping in a kind of harmony only greed can compose. "To Dad," my son Joseph said, raising his glass. His voice was steady, confident, almost rehearsed. "A man who built everything we have." The toast was met with applause, short and polite, followed by a burst of chatter. Someone added, "And may the legacy continue, preferably with central heating this time." Laughter filled the air again. I stood there for a moment, unsure whether to walk forward or stay unseen. The black of my dress made me blend into the shadows of the hallway. I could have been a guest or a ghost. Clarissa, my daughter-in-law, noticed me only when she lifted another bottle from the counter. "Mom, come sit," she said with a bright smile. "We're celebrating Dad tonight." Her words were sugar-coated and hollow. She didn't look at me when she said them. Her eyes were already fixed on the antique cabinet behind me. "That piece will look amazing in the new house," she whispered to Joseph, thinking I couldn't hear. The cabinet had been my wedding gift from my mother. I had kept it polished for 40 years. My grandson peeled a neon sticker from a roll in his hand and slapped it onto the cabinet door. "This one's mine." The laughter that followed had a rhythm now, punctuated by the crack of corks and the clinking of glass. I took a slow breath, the kind you take before entering a storm. The air smelled of perfume and roasted meat. My own plate waited at the far end of the table, beside the folding chair someone had brought from the garage. I sat down without a word. The chair wobbled. No one noticed. The food on my plate was the same meal I had cooked the night before my husband's heart stopped. The same roast chicken, the same potatoes, now cold and stiff. The irony of being fed my own leftovers did not escape me. From the far end of the table, someone spoke louder than necessary. "She looks exhausted. Maybe we should check her pulse before dessert." A wave of laughter rolled across the room. I smiled faintly, the way women are taught to smile when they're being humiliated politely. Clarissa raised her glass again. "To the future of Harrington Holdings." The chandelier caught her ring as she lifted her hand. It glinted like a small victory. Joseph nodded, his jaw sharp in the light. "To the next generation." My name wasn't mentioned. The house that once felt warm now echoed with the sound of cutlery and the faint buzz of phones. My grandchildren were recording videos of the table, of the silverware, of the art on the wall. One of them said, #Harrington Legacy, and giggled. I looked around the room. Every object had a sticker now. The clock, the chair, the rug. It looked like an estate sale that hadn't yet realized the owner was still alive. The noise blurred into a single hum. I found myself staring at the empty space where my husband's chair used to be. It had been moved. There was nothing there now but a rectangle of dust and a faint mark on the floor where the legs once stood. Joseph caught my gaze. "Don't worry, Mom," he said with a grin. "We'll keep it in the family." The family? I almost laughed. I pressed my napkin to my lap to hide the trembling in my hands. Underneath the fabric, my fingers brushed against the folded document in my pocket. The paper was old but solid, smooth from years of being touched. It carried a weight far greater than its thickness. Joint Trust Agreement, Paige Harrington. I had signed it beside my husband 20 years ago. The pen we used had blue ink, not black. I remember because I was the one who insisted on it. "Blue lasts longer," I said then, and he had smiled. "Good, you'll need it someday." I thought he was joking. A burst of laughter pulled me back to the present. Someone had just suggested turning the study into a home spa. Clarissa clapped her hands. "Yes, we can finally get rid of all those books. Who reads these days anyway?" Joseph nodded. "Dad never did." The laughter that followed was loud enough to drown the sound of my breath. I placed my fork down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the plate. The motion gave me something to do, something to focus on. My reflection shimmered faintly in the polished silverware, older, smaller, almost transparent. I wanted to leave, but the thought of standing, of drawing attention to my retreat, felt worse than sitting through the spectacle. So I stayed. I listened. The room buzzed with voices talking about renovations and vacations. Someone mentioned the lake house, another spoke about the yacht. A granddaughter argued over the Hermes scarves. "She's not using them anyway." The words hit like tiny stones. I glanced at the piano near the window. Its lid was closed, polished, untouched. I remembered the last time it was played. My husband had been there, leaning over my shoulder, humming a tune from our wedding. His hand had rested lightly on mine. The memory felt distant now, like a painting viewed through glass. The conversation at the table grew sharper. "So what happens with the main estate?" one of them asked. Joseph shrugged. "We'll know tomorrow at the reading." But either way, Dad made sure everything's under control. Clarissa smirked. "Assuming there are no surprises." I sipped my water slowly. The glass trembled against my lip. In their minds, tomorrow was a formality, a performance, a day to collect. In mine, it was the end of silence. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass cabinet again. My eyes looked calmer than I felt, not sad, not afraid, just awake. Let them laugh, I thought. Let them drink and divide. The house belonged to them tonight. But tomorrow, the truth would start belonging to me again. The party moved like weather through the rooms. Someone turned the music louder, and the beat pressed faintly under my ribs. Curtains breathed with the draft from the patio door. I could hear the clink of ice in glasses and the soft hush of designer fabric each time someone leaned over a chair that used to be mine. The night deepened, but it did not soften. It only clarified what had already been there. I stood and gathered plates, not because I had to and not to please anyone, but because the motion steadied me. My hands know this kitchen better than any place I have ever lived. I could walk through it with my eyes closed and still reach the tall cupboard where the good bowls are stacked and the drawer that swallows wooden spoons. I moved among the guests like a friendly draft, seen only when napkins needed refolding and crumbs needed brushing. No one stopped me. No one offered to help. I was the part of the house that people assume will keep working even when the power has gone out. In the sink, water ran hot and carried a ribbon of steam into the cold light. My ring clicked faintly against porcelain. Once, that sound meant an evening had gone well. Years pass and meanings slide. Behind me, Joseph described a future where the company would pivot, where the board would finally listen to his version of modernity. He was so certain that certainty itself seemed to have taken a seat beside him. Someone asked about the Paris apartment. Someone else asked if the boats would be consolidated. Clarissa floated through the talk like a swan, chin tilted, smiles distributed as if she were a diplomat in a country that belongs to her. I could tell she was keeping a private ledger under her skin. Wins, losses, potential upgrades. I rinsed the last glass until it sang and left it to dry on the rack. The kitchen window showed a slice of the yard where the roses were trying to survive the salt in the air. Those roses are stubborn, almost foolishly so. I have found them snapped by wind and bleached by winter, and still they find a small pulse in spring. People call that resilience. I call it memory. A root does not forget the map it learned when it was a young root. It knows where water is. When I turned off the faucet, the house suddenly felt too loud, like a theater where someone forgot to close the door to the street. I stepped back into the hall and let the noise pass through me. My granddaughter filmed a short loop of the chandelier, and her friend leaned into the frame with a kiss-shaped mouth. The friend whispered that old things are charming until they start to smell like old things. The whisper carried. I felt the sentence land on my shoulder like ash. I walked to the study. The door was open, and the smell of leather and paper waited for me like an old habit. Boxes had already been dragged across the carpet. I saw a neon sticker on the dictionary and another on the globe that spins on a brass axis. The globe had always pleased me. All that distance tamed by a finger. I set it spinning and watched a line of light slip along the oceans. The world is quieter when it is still, but it is truer when it moves. On the desk lay the fountain pen with blue ink that he kept for signatures that mattered. He liked the weight of it. He said you can hear a decision if the nib is good enough. I uncapped it and saw a thin vein of brightness along the tip. There's a tone only some metals make when they draw across paper. That tone sat at the edge of my hearing like a bell at dusk. I closed the cap and put the pen back in its tray. The memory of his hand on mine passed through me like a warm draft and was gone. A grandson stood in the doorway and looked at me as if I had wandered into an exhibit after hours. He asked if the piano could go to his apartment for a while until the will was settled. I told him the piano was not a travel instrument. He laughed and said he knew a company that could make anything travel if the price was right. He was polite about it, even sweet, the way boys are when they want something that is not theirs yet. I said he could ask me again tomorrow. He shrugged and wandered off with the ease of someone who has never waited long for anything. In the front hall, I found a folded chair leaning against the wall. Someone had written my name on a sticky note and attached it to the back as if a chair could be a person and a person could be stored. I peeled the note away and smoothed it between my fingers until it lost its stick. I carried the chair back to the garage. The garage smelled like cut grass and oil and a kind of boyhood that has no age. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling, labeled with seasons and sports, and one box that said important but not urgent, which is a phrase that can describe a life if you are not careful. I set the chair down quietly and stood for a moment in the soft dark. The concrete held the day's heat like a small animal. I could have stayed there a while, but I went back in. Houses do not like to be left alone while they are being divided. I passed the dining room again. Joseph was telling a story about his first bonus from the company. In his version, he fought for every dollar and brought the check home to a kitchen light that flickered cheerfully as if the house itself approved. He did not mention that I had sat up 2 nights in a row adjusting the deck he used for that meeting. He did not mention the pages I cut and the phrases I sharpened until they clicked like buttons slipping into the right holes. There is a kind of help that erases itself on purpose. It leaves no fingerprints because the person it helped asked for the kind of help that does not exist in public. That seemed noble to me then. It seems expensive now, not in money, in breath. Someone announced dessert. Someone else asked if the coffee machine still worked. Clarissa said the machine was ancient and sighed as if sighing could make a new one appear. I went to make coffee anyway. The machine wheezed and gurgled like an old dog, then did its job. I poured the cups and carried them out. Hands reached without looking. Thank you floated around me without landing anywhere in particular. When the tray was empty, I kept the last cup for myself and took it to the small room at the back of the first floor. We once called it the laundry room. They called it a utility space this afternoon with a tone that made the word sound like mercy. Someone had already pushed a narrow cot against the wall and set a blanket on it. A cracked photo frame sat on a box beside it, my husband's arm around me, a summer that still looked like it could last forever. I sat on the cot and let the coffee heat my hands. The light overhead flickered once and then steadied. The little window near the ceiling showed a thin band of night and the suggestion of the hedge beyond it. I could hear the house breathe in the way old houses do. Wood remembers weight. Pipes remember voices. Even paint remembers hands and the shape of a shoulder leaning during some tired evening. I slid the folded document out of my pocket and smoothed it across my knees. The paper held the faint scent of linen and the metallic ghost of ink. I touched my name and felt the old thrill of being someone who could write a name and make a thing real. People think the power is in the signature. It is not. The power is in the patient gathering that happens before the signature, in the days when you collect the facts that will not betray you. I returned the document to my pocket and leaned back on the cot for a moment. Above me, footsteps passed and passed again. A suitcase scraped against stair wood. The house knows the sound of leaving and the sound of moving in. These were neither. These were the sounds of claiming. I closed my eyes and counted breaths until the counting steadied me. I have learned to borrow calm from simple math. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 6. The longer exhale reminds the body that it is safe. Safety is a story the body believes sooner than the mind. When I opened my eyes, the room felt a fraction quieter. I stood and left the laundry light on for the sake of welcome and walked back toward the heart of the house. The corridor carried me like a gentle river. I stopped at the door to the patio and slipped out into the night. The sky had cleared. The wet stones reflected the house in broken lines. I could see faces in the windows moving through rooms that felt borrowed. The air held the salt of the sea and the faint smoke of a neighbor's fireplace. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and then settled back into dreams. I walked to the rose bed and knelt. The dirt was dry near the surface, but cool underneath where the sun had not reached for days. I pressed my palm to the soil and felt the small live insistence that earth always has when it is given attention. I whispered to the roots because I always have. I told them we would manage. I told them that winter is a story too, and that stories change their clothes and walk back into the room as new stories if you let them. When I stood, my knees protested in the language of joints that have carried more than their share. I did not mind. The body keeps minutes when the soul is too busy taking the floor. Back inside, the music had shifted to something slower. Voices wore a tired gloss. People began to leave in clusters, small satellites shaking hands at the door, promising to call, promising to never let the family drift apart. Promises are generous in doorways. The night accepts them and hands them back dull in the morning. At the threshold, Joseph hugged me. He smelled like cologne and a highball glass. His cheek was warm and careless against mine. He said we would talk after the reading tomorrow. He said there was a lot to sort through. He said I should get some rest. He meant it kindly. He did not mean it deeply. His kindness came from a habit of winning discussions early. Clarissa kissed my cheek without pressing her lips to my skin. She had already booked a contractor to tour the house next week. She told me not to worry about a thing. Her eyes slid past me to the staircase as if stairs were more reliable than mothers. At last the door closed and the house exhaled. The silence that followed had body. It moved through the rooms, tucking in corners and straightening the air. Houses do this when they are alone. They let go of the pose they hold for guests and return to their faithful temperature. The chandelier dimmed and the dining room returned to its old profile. I turned out the lights one by one. Each click felt like pulling a needle from delicate fabric without snagging the thread. In the study, I closed the pen drawer. In the living room, I straightened a frame. In the hall, I lifted the fallen corner of a rug that has outlived every trend. At the foot of the stairs, I paused and looked up into the shadow at the landing, where we used to stop and kiss goodnight, as if a stair could bless the next day. I did not go up. I went instead to my small room and closed the door gently with the pressure of 2 fingers. I sat on the cot and let the quiet fill in the parts of me that the evening had worn thin. I thought of the will and the words that would be spoken from a table I did not choose, and a voice that will feel like him and not like him. I thought of the recording I had not heard, but could already sense waiting inside its own box of air. I thought of the blue pen, and the night years ago when I wrote something that moved the board like weather, and then folded the pages neatly and watched them leave the house without a name the next morning. I took out a small notebook from the box beside the cot. The cover is plain and the pages are lined like a familiar road. I wrote a single sentence. I wrote that I am not here to collect. I am here to remember. Then I closed the book and placed it under the edge of the mattress for safekeeping. Above my head, the pipes gave a small sigh and settled. A car passed once and then the street went still. Somewhere deep in the house, a clock that no one had remembered to wind made a brave attempt at telling time and then fell quiet again. I folded myself under the blanket that had been left for me and let the fabric hold me the way memory holds a person when no one else is trying. Sleep did not arrive like a friend. It arrived the way fog does, hesitant at first, then complete. I lay on my side and watched the rectangle of night where the window met the hedge and imagined the sea on the other side of the hill taking its wide, slow breaths. The sea has never once asked for permission to continue. It continues because continuation is its job. I woke sometime after midnight to the fact that the house was listening. The particular silence of a place that expects something in the morning. I felt the weight of the document against my ribs and rested my palm there as if to greet an old ally. I whispered thank you to a past version of myself who knew how to make a decision and carry it without speaking. When I slept again, I dreamed I was back at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile and a row of blank pages waiting. The sound of a pen traveled across them. The sound was a path. I followed it. The line curved once, twice, and then opened into a room where everything I had not said was hanging on me like light. When morning came, I would open the door to a different house. Not because the furniture had moved, though it might. Not because the faces would be different, though they would. I would open the door to a house where my silence no longer performed tricks for other people. The last thought I had before daylight pulled me forward was simple and steady. Let them count their stickers. I will count my proofs. The will is tomorrow. I am still here. The house slept lightly that night. Every sound was sharper, as if the walls had learned to listen. I woke before dawn and lay still until I could tell the difference between my heartbeat and the ticking of the old clock in the hall. There is a strange quiet that belongs only to the hours after grief has been entertained, when guests have left and glasses have dried. The silence is not peace. It is rehearsal. I rose, wrapped the blanket around my shoulders, and went to the kitchen. The air had cooled, and the windows were still streaked with the ghosts of fingerprints. A few plates waited in the sink like loyal companions. I washed them slowly. Warm water and repetition help the mind remember what steadiness feels like. Through the doorway I could see the dining room. A candle someone forgot to blow out had collapsed into itself, a small tower of wax leaning in defeat. On the table, empty bottles leaned against each other like gossiping friends. The stickers they had used to mark their claims still glowed faintly in the dim light. One on the cabinet, another on the armchair. It was almost beautiful in a tragic way, how color could mark greed so honestly. When I turned, I saw that someone had left the will notice on the counter beside the fruit bowl. A folded envelope stamped with the law firm's insignia. My name was printed beneath Harold, smaller but still there. I traced the letters with a wet fingertip. The ink bled slightly and blurred my name into a soft haze, as if the paper itself was unsure of who I had become. The sea wind moved through the cracks in the window frame, bringing the scent of salt and pine. For a moment, I closed my eyes and imagined the house as it had been years ago. The laughter then was different. It had edges of work and ambition, but also warmth. Harold used to whistle when he came home, a tune that never had a name but always found its way back to me. I remembered the night the company nearly fell apart, the way he sat at the kitchen table with his hands buried in his hair. The world thought he built the empire alone. They never saw the nights we built it together, me with numbers and ink, him with faith that someone would believe. I rinsed the cup and set it down. The document in my pocket was still there, folded neatly, pressing against my side like a small reminder of consequence. I thought of Mr. Alden, the lawyer. He had known both of us since before success started speaking for us. He had promised me once that paper could defend even the quietest truth if it was written correctly. I had written it correctly. As light began to seep through the curtains, I moved through the rooms. The house looked almost innocent again. The chairs stood straight, the mirrors held their reflections honestly. Only the stickers remained, bright and childish against dark wood. I peeled one off the sideboard. The glue tugged at my fingertips, reluctant to let go. Beneath it, the wood was lighter, a clean square surrounded by years of polish. I rubbed the mark until it disappeared. Then I did the same for the next and the next. Each label came away with a soft sigh. It felt like the house was breathing again. By the time the sun reached the horizon, my pocket was full of crumpled colors. I threw them into the fireplace and watched them curl into ash. The flames made the glass of the framed photographs tremble. In one of them, Harold stood with his arm around Joseph, both smiling in front of the company's first office building. My reflection joined them for a moment before the fire dimmed and erased me from the glass. Footsteps came from the staircase. Joseph appeared, hair rumpled, eyes heavy. "You're up early," he said. I smiled. "Old habits." He yawned, poured himself coffee, and leaned on the counter. "Big day today?" "Yes," I said. "Big day." He studied me for a moment as if trying to measure how much I understood. "Mr. Alden called. The reading's at 10. You'll come with us, right?" "Of course." "Good," he said, though his tone didn't sound sure. "Clarissa wants to go over the guest house plans later this week. She says it'll be better for you, smaller, easier to manage." The words landed softly, but their shape was sharp. Smaller, easier to manage. "I'll think about it," I said. He nodded and sipped his coffee, relieved that I hadn't made things complicated. He left soon after, calling up the stairs for the others to hurry. When the door closed behind them, I stood for a long time in the empty hall. The house hummed faintly, as if waiting for me to move. I went to the study once more. Morning light pooled across the desk. The blue pen lay where I had left it. I picked it up and uncapped it. The ink caught the light, deep and certain. I wrote my name on a scrap of paper just to feel the weight of the motion. The line came out steady. I folded the scrap and placed it into my pocket beside the document. The two pieces of paper touched, one old and one new, the past and present quietly agreeing to remember each other. By 9:30, I was dressed and ready. The mirror in the hall showed a woman the color of winter glass. Age had softened the edges but not the gaze. I pinned my hair neatly and buttoned my coat. On the table near the door sat the small gold brooch Harold once gave me, the one shaped like a compass. I pinned it to my collar. He used to say it would always point home. I smiled at the thought that it might do that one more time. Outside, the car waited. The air was cold enough to bite, but it was clean, and the sky had cleared into the kind of blue that only shows up after a storm. I stood for a moment before getting in, looking back at the house. Through the windows, I could still see the faint flicker of the fireplace. The ash from the stickers had turned white. The ride to the law office took an hour along the coast road. Waves broke against the rocks, each one rising and falling with the same stubborn rhythm. The driver kept the radio low. News of markets and weather blurred together. I let the sound drift past me. My mind replayed moments I had thought were gone forever, the sound of Harold's pen scratching against paper, the way he paused before signing anything important, the look he gave me once when he said he couldn't have done it alone. He had meant it then, I think. Later, the world convinced him that alone was a better story. We reached the town square. The office stood at the corner, tall windows and brass handles polished to a shine. Mr. Alden was waiting near the door. His gray suit fit him like a memory that had been carefully maintained. He smiled when he saw me. "Mrs. Harrington," he said gently, "you look well." "Do I?" "As well as truth looks before it's spoken." He offered his arm, and I took it. The marble steps were cold underfoot. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and lemon oil. Family voices echoed down the corridor, already impatient, already loud. I heard Clarissa's laugh, bright as glass. Mr. Alden guided me into the room. The table was long, the chairs arranged with precision. The chandelier above us hummed faintly. Joseph sat near the head, flipping through a folder, his expression carefully neutral. The others greeted me with quick smiles that did not touch their eyes. I sat where they pointed, near the end of the table. The same position I had taken the night before. Some habits, it seems, are inherited more deeply than we realize. Mr. Alden took his place at the front. He opened his briefcase, drew out a recorder, and pressed play. The voice that filled the room was Harold's. For a moment, no one moved. The sound of him was softer than I remembered, but it carried the same authority. It carried everything. And as his words began to shape the air, I knew the world in that room was about to change. His voice filled the room like a tide that knew exactly where to stop. Harold did not hurry. He never hurried when he wanted people to understand. The recorder made a small mechanical breath and then settled into silence between sentences, the way a good witness pauses before the next truth. Around me, chairs shifted. A cough was swallowed. The chandelier hummed above our heads as if it had a stake in the outcome. "Good morning," he said on the tape, and the sound of that greeting walked across the table and sat down in front of each of us. "You are here because what we built is heavier than any one pair of hands, and because words matter, especially the ones you speak about your mother." A heat rose along my spine, not shame and not pride, but something that felt like a door unlocking in the oldest part of the house. Joseph stared at the table. Clarissa crossed one leg over the other and smoothed the crease of her skirt as if neatness could interrupt a recording. Mr. Alden stood with his palms resting on either side of the case, a quiet bridge between past and present. The voice continued, crisp and calm. "Mr. Alden has logged every word spoken in this house after the funeral. The home system kept better notes than any of you. You will find the transcript attached to the clauses you forgot you signed." Paper rustled at once, a single creature. I did not move. I watched the little red light on the recorder and let the room become a lens. When a family is about to change shape, you can feel it in the way air sits on the tongue. It tastes like metal and rain. The tape paused for a legal citation and resumed. "Words have weight. A punishment for words will be measured in weight and not in mood. 1,000,000 per word spoken in contempt of the woman who stood beside me when the light went out." No one breathed for a full heartbeat. Then 2, then 3. Joseph's hand found a pen and made it click twice before Mr. Alden looked up and the pen decided to be still. I did not speak. The recorder did it for me. It had no anger, only accuracy. It named dates and times, spelled out quotations down to the throwaway jokes that had landed on my shoulders like ash. It tallied the sentences and turned them into a number that looked too large to belong to a single family. The sum lived briefly in the air and then came to rest in front of my son like a debt that had been waiting patiently for the right morning. Before anyone could protest, the voice on the tape changed key. It was a tone Harold used when the board was about to say yes. "And one more matter," he said. "There is authorship to settle. There is a model with a name you never learned because I did not say it out loud. My mistake ends here." I felt the past rise, not as a flood, but as a staircase I had climbed before in the dark. The room dissolved into the soft blur you get before a storm breaks. I heard a gull outside scrape its voice against the sky, and then the room of years opened. Blue ink was our small superstition. When the company first began to wobble, bank statements arrived with a rhythm that made me wary. The numbers slid the wrong direction and took the ground with them. One night the house slept the way a house does when fear is sitting very still in the kitchen. He looked at me and said the kind of sentence that is longer than it sounds. "I think this is the end unless something strange and true happens by morning." Strange and true. I went to the drawer where we kept the letters that mattered and found the pen he had given me on a spring day when we believed good tools could summon good futures. The nib had a weight to it, a promise. I laid out paper and boiled chamomile and drew the first line. Not a sentence. A line to remind my hand that it could still make a road. It took hours. It took the version of myself that had postcards from another life tucked inside her ribs. The woman who had sat in lectures about market cycles and wrote essays that moved professors to see their own diagrams differently. I took the company apart the way you take apart a clock that has stopped. I arranged its pieces on the page. I asked what each piece wanted to do when it was honest. I wrote in the margins where costs had been hiding. I drew arrows that returned to the supply chain like birds finally remembering the direction of home. By 2 in the morning, the plan had a spine. By 3, it had a name, not a public name, a name you whisper to a document when it is brave enough to stand on its own. Harrington Model, not his model, not mine, ours, but ours would not sell and his would. I knew this with the cool clarity that comes when a person loves reality more than applause. I signed a pseudonym and sealed the pages in an envelope. I did not add a return address. The next morning, I took a walk to the post box at the corner where the sea wind makes flags talk to themselves. I placed the envelope inside and held the metal mouth closed for a breath longer than necessary. Then I went home and made breakfast and wiped the counter and kissed his cheek when he left for work. The day looked plain around us, and no one would have guessed that a life had changed its shoes at the corner and started walking in the right direction. Weeks later, the board called him a visionary. He came home with a light in his eyes that ran ahead of him into our hallway. He told me about the anonymous proposal that had arrived exactly when their pride could not hold the roof up any longer. He said the handwriting looked familiar in a way he could not place, and he laughed and kissed my hair and said that sometimes grace wears a mask to get the job done. The world is flattering when it wants a winner. It gave him interviews and dinners where a room stands up to greet your name. It gave him stories to wear until they felt like skin. It gave me silence that looked like love when you squint. I accepted the costume because I thought costumes were practical. They keep the weather off the truth. They also teach a person to stop checking if the truth is still breathing. Mr. Alden cleared his throat now in the present and placed a slender folder at the center of the table. He touched it the way you touch a sleeping child's hair. Inside are the originals, he said. Drafts, marginal notes, banking slips, a certified letter of intellectual property registration. The handwriting analyst has verified authorship. The ink composition test confirms the date. The model belongs to its author. The author sits at this table. Every face turned toward me and then away again, as if looking hurt more than not looking. Joseph's mouth opened and closed around a sentence that did not wish to be born. Clarissa gave a small surprised laugh that sounded like glass when a fork taps it too hard. The grandchildren hovered at the back of the room like a separate weather system, waiting to know which way to drift. I did not perform triumph. I did not know how, and I did not want to learn. I placed my hands on the edge of the table and felt the grain of the wood make its quiet map under my fingers. I nodded to Mr. Alden. He nodded back with the warmth of someone who has seen paper turn into a bridge. Harold's voice returned one last time. If you're tempted to be angry today, aim the anger at me. I let the story be simple when it was complicated. I asked her to be smaller because the world was made by men who believed smallness kept a marriage safe. Kept me safe, and it left her alone. I have written the truth into law. Do not argue with the law. It will outlive your temper. The tape clicked and stopped. A hush fell over the room that felt almost kind. The law clerk brought in the large envelope with its wax seal and placed it by Mr. Alden's hand. The formal reading began. Sentences arranged themselves into inheritance like chess pieces, moving with reason rather than wish. Clauses opened and closed. Percentages found their way to destinations. There were gasps in the places where people prefer applause. There were long blinks where a person places a polite curtain over an expression. I watched the papers pass as if they were migrating birds that had finally remembered how to read constellations. When my name arrived on the page, it did not feel like a victory. It felt like a correction made in careful ink so the document could do its work without wobbling. Joseph found his voice. He asked for reconsideration. He asked for context. He asked for deference to years of service. He did not ask for forgiveness because that would have required a kind of math he did not trust, the math of loss and restitution. Mr. Alden replied with the patience of a man who has argued with every kind of weather. The will is valid, he said. The addenda are valid. The recordings are valid. The registrations are valid. You may appeal, but please understand that an appeal is a bridge that leads back to this point. Silence again. The kind that arrives when a person sees the shape of a room for the first time even though they have lived in it for years. Clarissa folded her hands and unfolded them. The grandchildren looked at their feet as if their shoes could explain something. And then the oddest thing happened. Peace arrived not with a trumpet, but with a chair settling more comfortably under a body. The air lost some of its edge. Someone in the hall sneezed and said sorry to no one in particular. Mr. Alden asked if anyone needed water. Life re-entered the scene by the smallest door it could find. I realized my shoulders were no longer braced for impact. I let them fall back into their natural place. The compass pin at my collar felt heavier, as if it had finally found the direction it wanted to point. On the table beside the official envelope lay a small card in Harold's hand. The edges were softened by handling. Mr. Alden slid it to me without ceremony. I turned it over. A single sentence waited, simple as bread. "Thank you for drawing the map when I forgot how to read." I did not cry. Tears can confuse people into thinking they have understood the whole story. I picked up the blue pen on Mr. Alden's desk and wrote beneath the sentence, "You were not lost. You were late." Then I put the pen down and let the card be itself again. We rose. Coats were lifted. Polite words were exchanged in voices that sounded new to their owners. Outside, the sky had sharpened into a color the sailors claim for themselves. The wind off the harbor carried a clean edge that cut gossip into smaller pieces until it drifted away. Mr. Alden walked me to the curb. He said there would be paperwork for me to review and that he would come by the house in the afternoon to begin the transfer of deeds. He asked if I needed anything. "Only time," I said. He smiled. "Time has been waiting for you." In the car, I rested my hands on my knees and watched the town slide past its own brick. Shops were opening. A boy on a bicycle wove through a cluster of gulls and did not disturb a single wing. The driver asked if I wanted the radio. I said no thank you. I wanted to hear the sea breathe. On the hill above the water, the house stood as it always has, pretending it is made only of wood and glass. I stepped inside, and the hall greeted me with the faint scent of lemon and ash. The fireplace held its whitened secrets. The piano sat under its sheet of light. I walked to the study and opened the drawer that holds spare envelopes. I placed the small card inside and closed the drawer. On the desk, I laid out fresh paper. My hand hovered over it for a moment and then began to write the list a person writes when a life has turned from weather into road. Not a list of punishments or prizes. A list of names and places and the kind of calls that do not ask for anything except a chair and a listening ear. Blue ink flowed and made a quiet river across the lines. The sound of it was the oldest sound I know, older even than my name. It said continue. It said now. It said that the future is not new. It is simply the present with its coat off, ready to work. I paused and looked toward the garden through the window. The rose bed held its brown humility like a lesson. I thought of roots and how they do not need applause to grow. I thought of tomorrow and how it is not a separate country after all. It is only another room in the same house. When I set the pen down, my hand did not shake. The house was quiet, but not the old quiet of being overlooked. It was the practiced quiet of a workshop that knows useful noise is on its way. The wind met me at the door before I had even found the key. It slid through the hall, rearranging the smell of the day, paper, salt, the faint acid trace of coffee left in a cup. I hung my coat, turned off the alarm, and stood for a while with both hands flat against the wood of the front door. I wanted to feel the grain, to be sure that the house still recognized me. The silence after a verdict is different from other silences. It is not empty, it hums. The air trembles with the weight of things that will never be said again. I let it fill me. Then I went to the piano and lifted the lid. The keys were cool, their ivory slightly yellowed at the edges. I pressed one. The note came out clean. I pressed another, lower, softer. A chord shaped itself without asking. I smiled. For the first time in months, the sound of the house and the sound inside my head agreed on something. I played until the sun began to move through the windows, throwing squares of light on the floor like invitations. Each note thinned the fog around my thoughts. When I stopped, the last tone hovered in the air, a ghost that refused to disappear. In the kitchen, I made tea, the old way, leaves and patience. The cup steamed in my hands as I sat by the window and watched the sea fold itself against the rocks. I thought about Harold's voice and the way it had sounded both older and younger than I remembered. Regret has its own timbre. It wears the shape of apology but travels on the breath of time. He had meant to protect the company, to protect us, and in doing so he had hidden me behind his shadow. I did not hate him for it now. The years had taught me that even love can miscalculate. I opened the folder Mr. Alden had given me. The papers were still warm from his office. My name looked strange in print beside legal phrases and numbers that spoke of value. I traced the signature at the bottom, mine, in blue ink, and felt the pulse of recognition. It was like finding an old photograph of yourself taken before you learned to smile for other people. The lines were confident, the loops generous. That version of me had believed in both grace and precision. She still lived somewhere under my ribs. From the drawer, I took out the small notebook I had been keeping in secret for years. Between its pages were fragments, Formulas, projections, sentences I had written on nights when memory was louder than sleep. I turned to a blank page and began to write again, not plans this time, just truths that needed a body. I wrote that silence is not weakness, it is strategy. I wrote that every empire has a quiet architect. I wrote that tomorrow begins in ink. The pen glided easily, as if it remembered the route. Outside, gulls fought over something invisible. Their cries sounded like questions the sky didn't want to answer. After a while, I closed the book and went upstairs. The rooms still carried the footprints of the night before. Half-empty glasses, napkins like wilted petals, a faint smell of perfume clinging to the curtains. In the master bedroom, sunlight fell on the indentation of his pillow. I sat on the edge of the bed and ran my fingers over the fabric. The sheet was cool. I imagined his hand resting over mine one last time, steady, forgiving. On the nightstand stood the photograph from our anniversary, Harold and me in front of the new building, smiling at the future as if it had signed a contract to behave. I turned it face down, not out of anger, but to give the past a moment of privacy. Downstairs, the doorbell rang. Mr. Alden, punctual as ever. He stepped in with a folder thicker than before. Transfers, signatures, acknowledgments, he said. I nodded and led him to the dining table. He arranged the documents carefully, aligning each edge with the next until they formed a perfect rectangle. I signed where he pointed. The pen moved with confidence. Each signature sounded like closure disguised as progress. When we were done, he packed the papers and looked around. You know, he said, there are not many who manage to win without shouting. I had practice, I said. He smiled, a small, honest curve. What will you do now? I looked toward the garden. There's still work here. Roots to tend. Maybe some planting. Then I'll leave you to it. After he left, I went outside. The air had shifted. It carried the scent of thawing soil. I knelt by the rose bed. The stems were dry but not dead. I loosened the earth, watered it gently, and watched the surface darken. The water sank quickly, thirsty ground. I whispered, we're not finished, are we? The wind moved through the branches in answer. When I stood, my knees ached, but the pain felt clean. I wiped my hands on the hem of my sweater and looked back at the house. Light moved through the windows, settling on the piano, the stairs, the table. Every room looked a little less certain of its boundaries, as if it was ready to start over too. Inside, I brewed another cup of tea and carried it to the study. On the desk lay the same stack of unused stationery I had kept hidden all these years. I slid one sheet free and dated it. This time I did not write a plan for survival or a report for someone else's success. I began a letter to the women who will come after me, to the ones who keep their brilliance folded small because the world has not yet built pockets big enough for it. I told them that blue ink lasts longer, that the truth written in patience never fades, that silence is not surrender. It is simply the sound of preparation. By the time I finished, the light had changed again. Evening leaned against the windows, gold at the edges, soft in the corners. I placed the letter in a drawer-marked foundation and closed it gently. The name came to me then, uninvited but perfect, the Silent Women Fund. It would start small, a seed the size of an idea, but seeds have ambitions larger than gardens. I stood at the window until the first star appeared above the line of the sea. The horizon was a single stroke of cobalt, the exact shade of the ink that had carried my name through time. I thought of the pen lying on the desk, patient as always, and I knew that tomorrow I would use it again. Some nights end quietly because the day has said everything it needed to say. This one ended like that. The house sighed once, a sound between relief and recognition. I turned off the lamp, let the darkness settle around me, and whispered a promise to the air. Tomorrow I begin again. And for the first time, the words felt light enough to believe. The next morning arrived without ceremony. A thin mist lingered over the lawn, and the air inside the house tasted of old wood and something restless. I woke before the light fully reached the windows and sat for a while, listening to the distant hum of the sea. The quiet was neither kind nor cruel, it was simply waiting for me to move. Downstairs, I made coffee and let it cool on the counter. The cup left a small ring on the marble, a faint mark of presence. For a moment, I watched the circle fade and thought about how every mark in this house had been polished away until only the stories behind them remained. Harold used to say the house remembered what it was built for. I wondered if that memory included me. I walked through each room slowly, like a visitor. The living room smelled faintly of perfume and dust. The piano still gleamed, untouched since last night's final note. I traced my finger along its surface, feeling the smoothness where my husband's ring had once left a faint line. The hallway mirror caught my reflection, fragmented by morning light. The woman in the glass looked older than the one who had signed papers yesterday, but she also looked free. The sound of footsteps upstairs broke the quiet. Joseph's voice followed, low and clipped. "Yes, the move's confirmed. End of the month." Clarissa's reply was softer, but carried the edge of excitement. "Good. The new wing will be finished by then. She can stay downstairs until it's ready. We'll keep the top floors for us." Her laughter was small and efficient, the kind that didn't need joy to survive. I turned toward the kitchen door. They didn't see me standing there. When they came down, they were already dressed as if for another appointment. Clarissa's heels tapped across the floor like punctuation marks. "Morning," she said brightly, catching sight of me. "Did you sleep well?" "Well enough," I said. "Good. We've been talking about the layout. It'll be easier if we use the laundry room for your things in the meantime. It's close to the garden and you'll have privacy." Privacy. The word rolled out like a silk ribbon hiding wire underneath. Joseph avoided my eyes, pretending to check his watch. "It's temporary, Mom, just while we get everything sorted." I smiled because that was the language we all knew. "Of course," I said. When they left, I stood in the middle of the hallway until the sound of the car faded down the drive. Then I went to the laundry room. It was smaller than I remembered. The ceiling dipped slightly near the corner where the old pipes crossed. A single window let in a strip of light that cut across the floor like a blade. The washing machine hummed faintly, a rhythm of obedience. The air smelled of detergent and damp fabric, clean but tired. A folded cot leaned against the wall. Beside it, a cardboard box labeled "Misk" sat waiting. Inside were a few of my things: the photo of Harold and me, the compass brooch, a book with its spine cracked from years of reading. I placed them on the shelf carefully, arranging them as if their positions mattered. There was something comforting about the smallness of the room. It had no ambition to impress. It was honest about its purpose, to hold what others wanted washed away. I knelt to check the drawers under the counter. Old linens, spare keys, a roll of duct tape, a half-used candle. Behind the lowest drawer, something caught the light. I pulled it free, a thin wooden box, its corners darkened with age. The lid stuck for a moment before giving in with a soft sigh. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a stack of envelopes tied with blue ribbon. The ribbon had faded, but the knot was still tight. I untied it slowly. The first envelope bore my handwriting, dates, notes, formulas written in the same ink I used for the Harrington model years ago. Beneath it, a second envelope marked "Confidential, Accounts." My heart didn't race, it steadied. These were the forgotten receipts, the early drafts, the private ledgers I had hidden when Harold asked me to trust the company's accountant. I hadn't thought about them in years, yet here they were, intact, tucked beneath the heartbeat of the house. I spread the papers across the counter. Figures, letters, signatures, bank stamps, all the bones of a history that had never been told out loud. One document caught my eye, a transfer record linking our earliest investors to accounts still active under the family name. It showed withdrawals made long after Harold's heart had stopped. The air felt colder. I read it again. Then again. The signature wasn't his. It wasn't mine either. It was Joseph's. For a long time, I didn't move. The hum of the washing machine filled the silence like a mechanical lullaby. I folded the papers neatly and placed them back in the box, sealing it as if to preserve its breath. Later, I walked to the garden. The roses were beginning to lift their heads again. I brushed the soil from my hands and looked toward the house. Behind every window, I could feel their plans: new paint, new rooms, new futures. I smiled faintly. They thought they had pushed me into the basement of the story, but they had only placed me closer to the foundation. Back inside, I made tea and sat by the small window in the laundry room. The box rested on the counter beside me. I took one sheet of paper and began to write, not a letter this time, but a list. Dates, numbers, connections. Each word built a spine. When I finished, I signed it the same way I had signed everything that mattered, with blue ink. Then I reached for the phone. My hand hesitated only once before dialing a number I hadn't used in years. "Mr. Alden," I said when he answered. "It's Paige. I found something you need to see." He didn't ask what it was. "How soon?" he said. "Soon enough," I replied. "And tell me, does the law remember the dead?" "The good parts of it do," he said quietly. "Why?" "Because the living are starting to forget." I hung up before he could answer. Outside, the wind changed direction. The sky had begun to clear, and light spilled into the room, bright enough to touch every corner. Dust motes drifted like small secrets caught in sunlight. I looked at them and thought of Harold's voice from the recording, the apology that had sounded like closure. Maybe this was the unfinished part of his story, the one he couldn't write before he left. I opened the box again and ran my fingers over the blue ribbon. It had frayed at the edges but still held. So did I when evening came, the house above me filled with laughter again. Music, glasses, the easy rhythm of people who believe they have already won. I sat at the small table, listening, a quiet pulse beneath their celebration. Then I whispered to the room, "Let them dance. I'll handle the encore." And the house, faithful as ever, seemed to nod in agreement. The night returned heavy with voices. They came from the rooms above, soft at first, then growing bold as wine loosened the edges of conversation. I could hear Joseph laughing, Clarissa clinking glasses, a playlist whispering through the floorboards like rain on glass. Every sound settled in the laundry room as a faint vibration, a reminder that life above me carried on light, loud, unbothered. I sat at the small table with the wooden box open before me. The papers lay arranged in neat layers now, grouped by years, by names, by the kind of truth they could expose. I had been through them 3 times already, each reading sharper than the last. There was no mistake. The money trail was real, the transfers deliberate, the dates recent. My son had been moving the company's assets long before Harold died, possibly even planning to declare parts of it insolvent once everything was under his control. I had always known Joseph wanted to be powerful. What I hadn't known was that he'd rather inherit ashes than share a legacy. I picked up one of the receipts, an offshore transaction dated 6 months after Harold's death, and studied the ink. Black, not blue, the handwriting was rushed as though the signature had been practiced but never mastered. It was not just greed I saw, it was arrogance, the same brand that used to flare behind his teenage defiance when he thought rules were made for smaller people. I wondered how many times Harold had looked the other way before realizing the cost of his patience. The washing machine clicked, the cycle finished. The sound snapped me back to the present. I stood, emptied it, folded the clothes one by one. It was a habit that steadied me, repetition, order, control. I folded until every shirt, every towel was perfect, and then I looked at the neat stack and thought, this is what they believe I am built for: quiet competence, invisible precision. A woman who folds other people's messes. I laughed, but the sound surprised me, not bitter, not broken, just alive. It echoed off the tiles and came back as something like clarity. Upstairs, footsteps crossed the hall. The front door closed. A car engine turned over. The house exhaled. I waited until the last sound dissolved into distance before turning off the laundry light. The window's reflection caught my face, framed in the faint yellow glow of the garden lamp. I looked like my mother, tired eyes, a calm that people mistook for surrender. But her calm had built a family from nothing. Mine was about to rebuild one from the ruins of its own pride. I carried the wooden box upstairs. The air changed the moment I crossed into the living room. It smelled of perfume and burnt candle wax, of people too sure of their comfort. The stickers they had used to mark ownership still clung to furniture like bruises. I peeled one off the arm of the couch, another from the frame of the fireplace. The sound of the glue separating was satisfying, a small reclaiming. By the time I reached the staircase, my pocket was filled with crumpled colors again. In the study, the fireplace burned low. I set the box on Harold's old desk and sat down. The chair still held his shape. I could almost feel him leaning back, arms crossed, explaining a forecast or asking me to double-check a figure. For years we had shared this desk, back to back, like twin architects of a dream that had forgotten one of its designers. I reached into the drawer and found his fountain pen, the blue one, the weight of our past in my hand. I uncapped it, spread a clean sheet of paper before me, and began to write. Dear Mr. Alden, attached are the records discovered in the lower storage of the main house. They contain evidence of unauthorized withdrawals from the Harrington Trust and related accounts. The handwriting matches that of Joseph Harrington. I paused, considering how clinical it sounded. The truth deserved better than a memo. It needed intention. I continued. I request your immediate review and advice regarding the necessary proceedings to secure the estate and protect remaining assets. I am aware this will cause disruption within the family. Disruption, however, is overdue. Sincerely, Paige Harrington. I left the pen uncapped and stared at the signature. It looked deliberate, fearless even. The ink shimmered faintly under the lamplight, blue, not black. The same ink that had written our future once, now writing its reckoning. A creak came from the hall. I folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and sealed it. The steps drew closer. Clarissa appeared in the doorway, barefoot, holding her phone like a shield. Couldn't sleep? She asked. I was working, I said. She smiled, but her eyes flicked toward the papers on the desk. On what? Just cleaning old things, you know me. Her gaze lingered on the open box. She tried to hide her curiosity, but it trembled at the corner of her voice. "You always keep so many records." "They help the truth remember itself," I said. She laughed softly, a sound that didn't reach her eyes. "You're poetic tonight. Only precise." She nodded, hesitated as if searching for something kind to say, then turned to leave. "Good night, Mom." "Good night, Clarissa." When she was gone, I waited until her steps faded, then opened the drawer and hid the envelope beneath the stack of blank papers. Tomorrow morning, I would deliver it to Mr. Alden myself. Tonight, I wanted to let the house breathe again. I walked through each room, turning off the lights one by one. In the dining room, I paused before the mirror. My reflection looked steady now, no longer a guest in my own life. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the last of the colored stickers. One by one, I pressed them to the mirror until the glass was freckled with small, bright scars. Then I peeled them all off together and threw them into the fireplace. The flames caught fast, curling the plastic into shapes that reminded me of wings. I whispered, "Mine," not as a claim, but as an acknowledgement of the house, the silence, the woman who refused to vanish into either. When I returned to the laundry room, the window had fogged from the night air. I drew a small circle with my finger and looked out at the garden. The roses had started to bloom again, faintly, stubbornly. Their color was pale but alive. "Keep growing," I murmured. "We're not done yet." I sat on the edge of the cot and listened to the quiet above. It wasn't the silence of defeat anymore. It was strategy waiting. Tomorrow, the lawyer would receive the documents. The house would shift again, and somewhere inside that shift, justice would finally learn to speak in my voice. I closed my eyes, folded my hands, and smiled to the darkness. "They think they buried me in the basement," I whispered, "but this is where foundations live." The house, steady and listening, seemed to understand. Morning came bright and brittle, the kind of light that cuts through curtains no matter how tightly they're drawn. I woke to the smell of the sea drifting through the window and the sound of a single gull calling above the roof. For a moment I lay still, eyes open to the ceiling, the rhythm of the waves matching my pulse. Then I remembered what day it was. The envelope sat on the nightstand, the blue ink dry but patient. I ran my fingers across it and felt its pulse against mine. Today would not be about discovery. It would be about confrontation. In the kitchen, I found Joseph already dressed in a dark suit. His reflection glinted in the glass door of the refrigerator. He didn't turn when he said, "We should leave in 20 minutes. Clarissa's in the car." I nodded, poured coffee, and drank it black. The bitterness steadied me. He noticed the envelope in my hand but said nothing. The silence between us was taut but polite, the kind of silence people share when they both know there's a storm coming and have decided to walk straight into it. We drove without speaking. The car moved along the coast road, the sea flashing in pieces between the cliffs. Clarissa scrolled through her phone, pretending interest in nothing. Joseph tapped his thumb against the steering wheel, an impatient rhythm I'd known since he was a boy trying to lie about a broken window. Some habits don't fade, they just dress better. Mr. Alden's office looked the same as always: polished floors, glass walls, an air of professionalism that tried to disguise the human tension it contained. He met us at the door, warm as ever, but I could see it in his eyes. He already knew what I'd brought. The papers, the numbers, the proof. "Mrs. Harrington," he greeted softly. "Mr. Harrington, Mrs. Harrington," he added with a courteous nod to Clarissa. "If you'll follow me, the boardroom is ready." The boardroom. The word carried weight, memory, irony. Once it had been the theater of our ambition. Today it was the stage of our reckoning. The table was long, made of dark oak, polished so smooth it reflected the ceiling lights. Documents were arranged at every seat, precise, deliberate. My envelope rested on top of one stack, mine. Mr. Alden gestured for us to sit. He began with formalities. Clauses, valuations, property deeds, revisions signed in Harold's hand. My mind wandered between his words, tracing the sound of the pen scratching across paper years ago. Harold's pen, my ink, our empire. Then came the recording. Mr. Alden pressed play, and the room filled again with Harold's voice. "If you are hearing this," he said, "then the estate is being settled and the future is being decided. You will each hear what you have earned, not what you expected." Clarissa glanced at Joseph. He straightened, his jaw tightening. Harold's voice continued, calm and unflinching. "To my son Joseph, I leave the leadership of the company's public branch, with the condition that he maintains transparency and adheres to the compliance rules set forth. Should there be evidence of misconduct, the ownership will revert to the joint trust under Paige Harrington's direction." Joseph froze. "What?" Mr. Alden didn't pause. "To my daughter-in-law Clarissa, I leave the shares associated with her personal contribution, as documented by the audit team. Any assets gained through misappropriated funds will be forfeited upon discovery. Clarissa's color drained. This is absurd, Harold's voice pressed on. And to my wife, Paige, to the woman who built the framework of everything that bears our name, though the world never knew it, I leave the final authority of the trust, the rights to the original Harrington model, and the freedom to do with it as she sees fit. The room fell silent. Joseph slammed his palm against the table. This is manipulation. He wasn't in his right mind. Mr. Alden lifted his gaze slowly, his tone even. The will is fully authenticated, Mr. Harrington, you know that. I watched my son's face collapse in disbelief. Clarissa reached for his arm, whispering something meant to sound comforting but coded in calculation. Then I spoke, my voice calm. There's something else. All eyes turned to me. I slid the second envelope across the table, the one I had written last night. These are financial records from the early trust accounts, transactions made under Joseph's authorization. They involve the assets Harold and I established long before his death. Withdrawals continued after. Joseph's head snapped toward me. You went through private files? They were in my house, I said quietly. Nothing there is private. Mr. Alden opened the envelope, scanned the first page, then the second. His eyes hardened. These are extensive. Clarissa's hand slipped from Joseph's arm. You didn't tell me about any of this. He shot her a look sharp enough to cut. Because it doesn't matter, they're family accounts. Mr. Alden closed the folder. Not when they were moved into shell companies. Some of these accounts are registered offshore. Joseph's voice cracked. He would have wanted me to protect the assets. No, I said softly. He would have wanted you to protect the name. The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend the air. The only sound was the faint hum of the recorder as Harold's final words played again, almost like an echo returning to claim what it was owed. To my wife, he said one last time, I leave the truth. Mr. Alden stopped the recording. The phrase hung between us, neither blessing nor curse. I looked at my son and felt the ache that only a mother could know, the ache of recognition. The boy who once carved his initials into the piano lid now sat in front of me as a man who had tried to carve himself into history at any cost. And yet, even now, I wanted to believe there was a version of him who could still learn. Joseph, I said gently, there's a way to make this right, not for me, for you. He didn't answer. Clarissa was already standing, gathering her purse, her voice low but sharp. You've humiliated us. Congratulations. This isn't humiliation, I said. It's revelation. She left first, the door clicking shut behind her. Joseph stayed. His hands covered his face. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. You think this fixes anything? I think it starts something, I said. A repair doesn't begin until the damage is admitted. He rose abruptly, chair scraping against the floor, and stormed out. Mr. Alden waited until the door closed before speaking. You knew this would happen. I hoped it wouldn't, I said. He nodded slowly. You've done more than most would dare. I smiled faintly. I didn't dare, I endured. He packed the papers into his case, leaving the envelope with me. The trust reverts to your control effective immediately. I'll handle the legal process. There's nothing more you need to sign today. When he left, I stayed in the empty boardroom. The sunlight through the window made the dust shimmer like a galaxy caught in stillness. I reached for the recorder, pressed play again, and listened to Harold's voice, softer now, but steady. Paige, he said, almost tenderly. I never told you enough. You were the architect, I was the front door. Together we built a house the wind couldn't shake. Don't let them turn it into a museum. I closed my eyes and let the words find their place inside me. For the first time in years, I felt what I had forgotten to allow myself release. Outside, the wind carried the scent of salt through the open window. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the tide was shifting again, and I knew I was finally standing where the foundation began. The building emptied slowly after that. Secretaries moved like shadows behind the glass walls, their heels ticking across the floor, their voices careful. A few glanced in through the open boardroom door and then looked away quickly, as if they had caught sight of something too private to name. I stayed seated, hands resting on the smooth table. The silence was clean now. When I finally rose, I did not hurry. Outside, the city had softened. Light slanted across the street in long gold lines. Cars passed in gentle rhythm, and the wind off the sea carried a faint chill. Mr. Alden was waiting by the steps. He had that calm a man wears when the hard part is done but the aftermath has just begun. It will take a few days to process everything, he said. The board will be informed, the accounts frozen until the audit is complete. Let them freeze, I said. Maybe it will remind them what stillness feels like. He smiled faintly. You could take a break, the trust gives you options now. Travel, rebuild somewhere else. I'm not done here, I said. The house still breathes. I need to see what it becomes when the noise dies. He nodded. Call me when you're ready for the next step. I walked to the car. The driver opened the door, but I told him I'd prefer to walk. The air felt alive, unfiltered. I needed to hear the ground under my shoes. The walk back to the house took nearly an hour. Along the way, I stopped once, at a cafe where Harold and I had met the investors for the first time decades ago. The building had changed owners, but the smell of roasted beans and salt air was the same. I sat at the counter and ordered tea. The waitress, young enough to be one of my granddaughters, smiled and asked if I wanted sugar. No, I said, just strong. When she set the cup down, I traced the thin circle of steam and watched it vanish. For years, I had measured time by deliverables, quarterly reports, fiscal calendars, board votes. It was strange now to sit still and measure it by breath. I left a generous tip and walked the rest of the way home. The house greeted me with its usual quiet, the kind that waits before choosing a side. Afternoon light filtered through the windows, catching the dust in a soft gold haze. The dining table was still as we had left it, chairs slightly askew, an echo of confrontation hanging in the air. I set my purse down, took off my shoes, and moved barefoot through the rooms. Each step made the floorboards creak in familiar rhythm. I went to the study and opened the windows wide. The sea breeze rushed in, cold and clean. Papers fluttered on the desk, pages of truth lifting like wings before settling again. For a while I just stood there, breathing. Then I reached for the old notebook and wrote a single sentence on its first blank page. The house remembers who built it. The words came easily. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement outside, a car pulling into the driveway. Joseph, alone this time. He stepped out slowly, his suit jacket hanging open, his face older than it had been that morning. I met him at the door. May I come in? He asked. You're still family, I said. That's something I don't revoke. He followed me into the living room and stood near the piano. The air between us felt heavy, but not angry, more like the silence after a storm when both the wreckage and the sky are deciding what to do next. He looked around the room. She's gone, he said quietly. Clarissa packed a bag and left. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it. He nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. I didn't know he stopped, swallowed hard. I didn't know how far I'd gone until today. It's easy not to notice, I said. Ambition sounds a lot like applause when you're young. He looked up. I wanted to be like him. You were, I said, just not in the ways that mattered. He laughed once, bitter and small. You think this can be repaired? I think everything can grow again if you stop cutting at the roots. He sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, and buried his face in his hands. The light moved slowly across the carpet. Minutes passed before he spoke again. Dad always said you were the calm one. I used to think he meant quiet. I didn't realize calm could be a kind of weapon. It isn't a weapon, I said. It's a way to build walls that don't fall when people start shouting. He nodded, a fragile understanding forming behind his eyes. What happens now? The company will continue, I said, but not as it was. There will be an audit, a reorganization. You'll have a choice: stay and rebuild it properly or step away. And you? I'm not staying forever, I said, but I'll leave it standing. He leaned back, exhaled, and stared at the ceiling. He loved you, even when he forgot how to say it. I know, I said. He left enough silence for me to hear it. Outside, the wind shifted. The curtains billowed, letting in a brighter light. Joseph stood, hesitating for a moment before stepping closer. I'm sorry, he said. The words were clumsy, but they were real. I believe you, I said. That's a start. He left soon after, quieter than he'd arrived. I watched the car disappear down the road, the trail of dust it left curling into the sky. Back inside, I went to the garden. The roses had begun to open more fully now, their petals unfolding toward the late afternoon sun. I knelt to trim the dead leaves, the earth cool beneath my fingers. When I straightened, the house stood behind me, no longer a monument to what was, but a witness to what could still be. I whispered to the air, "We're not done, Harold, not yet." The wind answered softly, carrying the scent of salt and bloom. For a moment, I almost believed it was him, somewhere between the sea and the sky, telling me to keep going. I went back inside, washed my hands, and sat at the desk once more. The blue pen waited where I'd left it. I uncapped it and wrote another line beneath the first. The future begins when the truth stops whispering and learns to speak out loud. Then I closed the notebook, set it aside, and watched the horizon through the open window as evening gathered its colors. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more signatures, more consequences. But for the first time in years, none of it frightened me. The truth was mine now, and I was finally ready to live in a house built on it. Morning broke with a clarity I had almost forgotten existed. The storm had passed in every sense of the word. Outside, the air was crisp, rinsed clean by the night rain. The horizon stretched wide and blue, and for once I didn't feel the weight of the house pressing down on me. It was breathing again, so was I. The phone rang just as I finished my tea. Mr. Alden's calm voice came through, efficient as always. "The audit is complete," he said. "It confirms everything you provided. The board has convened an emergency meeting this afternoon. They'd like you to attend." "Would they?" I asked quietly. "They have little choice," he said, "but I think you should go." "I will. Be prepared," he added, "not for a fight, for the silence that follows one." When the call ended, I looked around the study. The air carried the faint scent of ink and salt. Papers were stacked neatly on the desk, ready for the next beginning. I picked up the blue pen, slipped it into my coat pocket, and left for the city. The boardroom was larger this time, filled with people who had once treated me like furniture, the polite kind, expensive but voiceless. Now their smiles were measured, cautious. Power, I realized, changes the temperature of a room. Today it was colder, but it was mine to warm if I chose. Mr. Alden stood beside me, his expression unreadable. Across the table, the board members shuffled papers as though words could shield them. At the head sat a man I barely recognized, Joseph. His tie was perfect, his eyes ringed with fatigue. He began the meeting before anyone else could. "The investigation confirms what was already made public yesterday," he said, voice steady but thin. "Funds were redirected without authorization. I take full responsibility." Murmurs rippled around the table. The board's faces flickered between sympathy and calculation. One of the directors, a man who had once dismissed my suggestions in every meeting Harold brought me to, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harrington, given these findings, the decision of control naturally falls to you. What are your intentions for the company?" Every eye turned to me. I could feel their questions, their fear disguised as curiosity. I let the silence hold for a moment before speaking. "My intentions," I said slowly, "are to remember why this company existed in the first place. It was not built to compete with empires. It was built to outlast them. We will return to that." Another director, younger, leaned forward. "Does that mean restructuring?" "It means cleansing," I said, "and renewal. The Harrington model wasn't designed to chase profit, it was designed to sustain integrity. Somewhere along the way, we lost that." Mr. Alden slid a folder toward me. "These are the revised ownership documents," he said. "Your signature will finalize the transfer." I took out the blue pen, uncapped it, and signed. The ink spread smoothly, quiet, and sure. When I placed the pen down, the sound of it meeting the table felt like an ending and a beginning all at once. Across the room, Joseph watched. His expression was unreadable, not anger, not surrender, something in between. He looked like a man learning what humility tasted like. When the meeting ended, he approached me. "I'll step down after the transition," he said. "I know it's what you want." "It's not what I want," I replied. "It's what the company needs." He nodded. "Still, I'm sorry." "I know," I said, "and I believe you." As he walked away, I felt neither triumph nor sorrow, only release. Outside, the afternoon sun hit the glass walls of the building, scattering light across the pavement. I stood for a while, watching people move through the city with their own burdens, their own reckonings. Then I walked to the cafe by the harbor and ordered a cup of tea, the same as I had the day Harold, and I signed our first contract. The woman behind the counter smiled politely, unaware she was serving the woman who owned the company that overlooked this very coast. Ownership. The word had always felt like a man's privilege, a title carved into metal plates and office doors. But as I sat by the window, watching the tide pull in and out, I realized it was simpler than that. Ownership was just another form of memory, the courage to keep what history tried to take away. When I returned home, the air inside was light. The boxes from the upper floors had been moved out. The furniture was back where it belonged, unmarked, unclaimed. I walked through the rooms slowly, touching surfaces, reclaiming them without ceremony. In the dining room, I paused by the piano. The lid was closed, its surface gleaming in the evening light. I sat and opened it. My fingers found the keys naturally, and I played the same tune Harold used to hum. It sounded different now, not nostalgic, but alive. When I finished, I spoke softly into the air as though he could still hear me. "We did it," I said. A breeze slipped through the open window, stirring the curtains. The house seemed to exhale. Later, I sat in the study and began to write again, not for legal purposes, not for defense, but for creation. I drafted the charter for what would come next, the Silent Women Foundation. Its purpose was simple: to fund education, innovation, and recovery for women whose ideas had been buried beneath louder names. Each clause I wrote was an echo of something I had lived, each line a promise that silence, once weaponized, could become a form of power. The ink flowed smoothly. When the last sentence was done, I leaned back and read it aloud. Founded by Paige Harrington in memory of those who were never remembered. I smiled. It was not the smile of victory. It was the quiet satisfaction of alignment, of finally seeing my reflection in the work I created. Outside, twilight spread across the horizon. The roses in the garden swayed gently, alive with color again. Their petals glowed faintly in the fading light, as if the house itself had decided to bloom. I opened the window and whispered, "Let it grow." And for the first time in a lifetime of building things for others, I realized this foundation, this moment, this piece was truly mine. I stayed at the desk long after the ink had dried, letting the lamplight fade across the paper until the words almost seemed to sink into it. Outside, the sea shifted colors: slate, then silver, then black. The horizon swallowed the last trace of daylight and gave nothing back but quiet. I closed the notebook and felt its weight settle in my hands. The beginning of something had its own kind of gravity. From the hallway came the small ticking of the clock that Harold had once wound every Sunday morning. I rose and went to it. The glass face caught my reflection, and for the first time, it didn't look like a stranger. I wound the clock, not for memory but for rhythm. The gears caught, and the old mechanism began again. That steady sound filled the room, a heartbeat borrowed from another age. Later, I brewed a pot of chamomile tea and took it to the garden. The night smelled of damp soil and salt. I sat on the stone bench beside the roses, their petals just visible in the moonlight. They were still fragile, but standing. The same could be said of me. I thought of the foundation, of the women it would serve, not out of charity, but reclamation. Every idea smothered by someone louder, every invention signed under another name, every dream that had to ask permission before breathing. I wanted them to have a home, a table that didn't need permission to be theirs. When Harold and I built the company, we had believed in fairness. We simply hadn't understood how easily fairness can be traded for convenience. He had called it compromise. I had called it patience. Now I saw what it really was: silence mistaken for peace. I sipped the tea and listened to the ocean. The tide was full tonight, reaching closer to the rocks than usual. It sounded like applause from another world. Back inside, the house glowed with a gentler light. I went room by room, turning off lamps, smoothing curtains, touching the walls with a kind of affection. The house had carried our secrets long enough. It deserved rest too. In the hallway, I stopped by the photograph of Harold and me on the day we broke ground on the first building. We were both younger, our hands still dirty from the soil where the future would stand. I traced the outline of our faces on the glass and whispered, "It's built, Harold." It's still standing. The phone rang, a soft vibration against the silence. I answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Harrington," Mr. Alden's voice said, calm but carrying something new underneath. "The transfer of control has been officially recorded. The board will issue a public statement in the morning." "And Joseph?" I asked. "He's agreed to step down. He's quiet. Perhaps in time he'll understand the gift you've left him." "Understanding takes longer than forgiveness," I said. He paused, then asked, "Will you attend the press announcement tomorrow?" "No, let the story speak without me. My presence would only turn truth into theater." He exhaled softly, as if relieved. "Then we'll handle it. Congratulations, Mrs. Harrington. You've done what most only try to dream." "Dreams are easy," I said. "They don't require evidence." We exchanged goodbyes and I hung up. For a long moment I stood in the quiet. The word foundation echoed in my mind, both the literal one beneath the house and the one I was about to build beyond it. They felt the same. Strong, unseen, necessary. I climbed the stairs to my room and opened the balcony doors. The wind swept in, cool and cleansing. The sea stretched out in darkness, its rhythm steady, ancient. I leaned against the railing and let the sound fill me. A faint light flickered at the edge of the horizon, a fishing boat perhaps, or something less ordinary. I remembered how Harold used to stand here, watching the same horizon, believing every problem could be solved if you looked at it long enough. I used to think that made him naive. Now I understood it made him human. On the nightstand lay a half-burned candle, a relic from the memorial service months ago. I lit it again. The flame wavered, small but insistent. Its reflection danced across the window pane, painting the room in shades of gold. I took the compass brooch from my dresser and turned it over in my hand. The needle trembled, pointing toward the sea. "Home," Harold had said when he gave it to me. "No matter where we are, it will find its way back here." I pinned it to my robe and whispered, "I know, it found me." Sleep came easily that night. When I woke again, dawn had already spilled across the sky, soft pink melting into gold. The phone buzzed with new messages, news outlets, congratulations, cautious invitations. I ignored them all. Instead, I dressed in linen, tied my hair back, and went to the garden. Mr. Alden arrived just as the first light hit the roses. He carried a briefcase, but his expression was more personal than professional. "I thought you'd want to see this," he said, handing me a folded newspaper. The headline read, "The Real Architect of the Harrington Legacy." Beneath it, a photograph of the house. The story didn't use my name in the headline. It didn't need to. The article itself was restrained, factual, respectful. It spoke of fairness, of revision, of truth finding its rightful author. I handed it back to him. "It's enough," he nodded. "What will you do now?" "Begin," I said. He smiled. "You make that sound so simple." "It is. Beginning always is. It's the staying that takes strength." He left soon after, his car fading down the drive. I remained in the garden, trimming the roses, thinking of what beginnings looked like when they were honest. By noon, the papers were filed. The company would continue under new leadership, not mine, not Joseph's, but a board rebuilt with the same diversity I had once been denied. The foundation documents were signed, sealed, and set to launch within the month. I had no desire to attend the ceremony. The work was done. The noise could belong to someone else. As evening approached, I stood at the window of the study and watched the light shift once more. The house seemed taller somehow, less burdened by its walls. I took the blue pen from the drawer and wrote a single line on the last page of my notebook. We build, we lose, we rebuild, and in between, we learn the architecture of ourselves. Then I closed it gently, as if tucking a story into bed. Outside, the sea gleamed with the reflection of a new moon. Somewhere beyond that horizon, everything I had feared had already sunk. What remained was this: a woman, a house, a name restored. The reckoning was over. The rebuilding had already begun. The first real quiet came weeks later. Not the heavy silence of grief, nor the poised stillness before confrontation. This was different. It was a silence that felt earned, shaped by resolution. The kind that lets the air settle after everything that could break has already done so and chosen, somehow, to mend. The newspapers had moved on. The headlines that once screamed about betrayal and inheritance had given way to newer scandals, younger names. I was no longer the woman in their columns. I was simply Paige again. I liked it that way. The house, too, had transformed. Workers came and went, restoring what neglect had dulled. The wallpaper in the study was replaced with soft cream, the wood polished until the grain shone. The scent of varnish lingered in the air, a smell of renewal. I had the laundry room repainted and fitted with shelves for the foundation's paperwork. The space that once served as exile was now the heart of the new beginning. On the first morning after the renovation, I opened every window. The sea wind swept through the house, billowing curtains, rattling doors, laughing its way through the halls. For the first time in years, the house didn't resist it. It welcomed the world back in. The foundation had been running for 2 weeks. There were letters, dozens of them, from women across the country. Some typed, some handwritten. Stories of work taken without credit, of ideas dismissed until someone else repeated them louder, of dreams paused indefinitely for lack of permission. Every story felt like a mirror held up to my past. I read each one carefully, sometimes aloud, sometimes with my eyes closed, letting the words live in the air before I filed them away. The first grant was approved that morning. A scholarship for an engineer in Marseille developing sustainable coastal housing. I smiled when I read her proposal. The opening line read, "Every structure begins with trust." I took that as a sign. Later that afternoon, I met with the small team that now managed the foundation. We gathered around the kitchen table, a far cry from the boardrooms of glass and steel where I used to sit like a ghost in the back row. Here, the light was warm, the air smelled faintly of rosemary, and the conversation flowed with something that felt like belonging. "Should we include a statement about the Harrington model's origins?" asked Isla, the youngest on the team, her accent soft and uncertain. I looked at her and saw the same fire I once carried but had been taught to hide. "No," I said gently. "Let the work speak for itself. People don't need to know who built it, just that it's still standing." She smiled and nodded. "Understood." After they left, I stayed behind to clean up. The teacups clinked softly as I placed them in the sink. Through the open window, I could hear the faint hum of the waves. Every sound seemed to move in harmony now, like the house had learned to breathe in time with the sea again. Evening fell quietly. I lit a single candle in the study and sat by the window with my journal. My hand moved easily, almost without thought. Legacy is not about what survives you, I wrote. It's about what changes because of you. The words felt true in a way that didn't need proof. I thought about Joseph, how he had written to me from the countryside a week ago. The letter was short, awkward, sincere. He was rebuilding himself, volunteering at a local school, teaching young engineers how to design water filtration systems. He ended the letter with, "I think Dad would have approved of what you did. I'm starting too." I had read that line more times than I would admit. Forgiveness, I realized, was not a door that opened once, it was a house with many rooms, and I was still learning which ones I wanted to keep unlocked. A soft knock broke my thoughts. When I opened the door, Mr. Alden stood there with his usual composure. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. "I was in the area and thought I'd bring you this." He handed me a thin, leather-bound folder embossed with the foundation's name. Inside were photographs from the first scholarship ceremony. Young women, all different, all radiant in the way that people look when the future has finally remembered them. "They insisted on sending these," he said. "Said you were the reason they believed they could start." I looked through the pictures one by one. There was joy there, but also determination, the kind that grows from surviving underestimation. "They don't owe me anything," I said softly. "No," he replied, "but they'll remember you anyway." He stayed for tea, and we spoke for a while about things that didn't require signatures, the weather, the roses, the new piano tuner who was due next week. When he left, I walked him to the gate. The evening sky was a wash of lavender and silver, the horizon still humming with the day's last light. After he drove away, I stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at my sleeves, and thought about how endings aren't always loud. Sometimes they arrive like this, gently, almost shyly, disguised as continuity. Back inside, I went to the piano. Dust had settled on the keys again, but the sound was still pure. I played the same melody I had played the day the company became mine. It had changed somehow, lighter, freer, no longer bound to grief. Halfway through the piece, I heard another sound, faint, like a note struck from somewhere else. I looked up and saw it. The photograph of Harold and me had fallen slightly sideways, leaning against the frame. I rose, straightened it carefully, and whispered, "Still keeping time with me, aren't you?" The candle flickered once, as if answering. I smiled and sat back down. The melody continued, softer, slower, a conversation between memory and possibility. When I finished, the house was silent again, but it wasn't empty. It was alive with something I couldn't name, maybe grace, maybe peace, maybe just the sound of things finally belonging to themselves. I closed the piano lid, turned off the lamp, and let the dark fold around me. Tomorrow, the world would wake again, full of noise, ambition, movement, and somewhere in that rhythm, women I had never met would take their first steps into a room that once wouldn't have opened for them. And that, I thought, was enough. The following morning arrived soft, almost hesitant, as if the world itself wanted to approach quietly so it wouldn't disturb what I had finally made whole. A silver fog hung low over the garden, blurring the edges of the roses and the path that wound toward the sea. The air smelled faintly of rain and lavender. I dressed slowly, in a white linen blouse and the same slate-gray trousers I used to wear on site visits long ago. They still fit. There was something comforting about that, the small proof that I hadn't changed shape, only direction. On the desk by the window sat a letter sealed in blue wax. It had arrived late last night, slid beneath the door after I had already gone to bed. The handwriting was familiar. Joseph's. I held it for a while before opening it, tracing the indentation of each letter. "Mother, I've been thinking about what you said about repair. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness, but I want to learn what it looks like. I'm helping the school here build a workshop for the students. We're naming it the Harrington Room. It doesn't carry the weight of our past, it just honors the work that lasts. If you ever visit, you'll see your compass brooch hanging above the door. I kept one of your letters there too. The one that says every empire has a quiet architect." The students read it like scripture. "Thank you for not erasing me. Joseph." I folded the letter back into its envelope and pressed it to my chest. My throat ached, but not from sadness. There are moments when emotion feels like architecture built from both the things you lose and the things you manage to keep standing. This was one of them. I opened the window and let the morning light in. The fog was thinning, revealing the faint outline of the sea. In the distance, the sound of a bell echoed, perhaps from the harbor, perhaps only imagined. On the kitchen counter lay the day's schedule, a meeting with the foundation's new grant committee, a call from a journalist, a visit to the local art school. I smiled at the list. It was full but not heavy. This time, work didn't feel like an obligation, it felt like inheritance redeemed. When Isla arrived for our morning check-in, she brought croissants and coffee. She set the tray down and grinned. "You're trending again," she said, sliding her phone across the table. On the screen was a photo of the scholarship recipient standing beside a banner that read the Silent Women Foundation, second cycle open. The caption beneath it read, "Paige Harrington turns silence into structure." I laughed softly. "That's very dramatic for breakfast." "It's the internet," Isla said. "They like their heroes with poetic taglines." "I'm no hero," I said, "just a builder." "Exactly," she replied. And builders change the world quietly. After she left, I walked through the house again. Every corner carried a new kind of calm, not emptiness, but completion. The laundry room, now bright and orderly, smelled faintly of paper and cedar. The study was lined with folders and letters, but not the kind that demanded signatures, the kind that promised beginnings. I paused by the piano. A single sheet of music rested on the stand, notes scribbled in blue ink. It was Harold's handwriting or mine. It was from one of the girls at the foundation, a composer from Italy who'd written to thank me for funding her first project. The piece was titled Inheritance. I pressed one key, then another. The melody was unfamiliar but gentle. Each note seemed to drift upward, threading itself through the beams of the ceiling, through the walls, through time itself. As I played, the light shifted, breaking through the last of the fog. Sunlight poured across the floorboards, illuminating the faint scars and knots in the wood, imperfections that told the story of every season this house had survived. I thought of Harold again, of his laughter echoing down these same halls, of his belief that legacy was something built, not given. Perhaps he had been right all along. We had simply disagreed about who deserved to build. When the last note faded, I whispered to the empty room, "We did it, love." The house held. The breeze moved through the curtains as if answering. That afternoon, I walked down to the shore for the first time in months. The tide was low, revealing the rocks where Harold used to skip stones. I sat on one of them, the wind catching my hair, and watched the waves slide in and out. The sea had always been honest, unpredictable, merciless, but incapable of lying. It took what it needed and returned what it could. I opened my notebook and began to write the closing entry of the chronicle I had been keeping since the first night after his death. There was a house built on compromise, and within it lived a woman who mistook silence for strength. She learned, too late and yet just in time, that silence is only noble when it is chosen. Now the house breathes again, not because the storms have ended, but because its walls learned to bend without breaking. I paused, the pen hovering over the paper, then added the final line, and when the tide returns, it will find her still here, the quiet architect of what endures. I set the notebook down beside me and watched as the sea wind turned the pages. The paper rustled softly, almost like applause. Behind me, the house stood firm against the horizon, bright, unafraid, its windows open to the light. I rose, brushed the sand from my hands, and began walking back up the path. The sun was warm on my face. Each step felt lighter than the last. There would always be more to build, that was the truth of it. But for now, the foundation was strong. And for the first time in a very long time, I was not building for survival. I was building for joy. The seasons turned quietly, the way a page lifts itself in a breeze before falling open to something new. Summer melted into late autumn, and the garden outside the Harrington house grew heavier with color, golds, ochres, and deep reds tangled in the vines that had once been bare. I woke each morning to the same rhythm now: kettle, notebook, piano. Routine had become a kind of prayer, one that asked for nothing and gave me peace in return. The foundation had grown beyond anything I imagined. What started as a single desk in the old laundry room had become an entire network. Architects, engineers, writers, coders, all women who built, repaired, and dreamed in blueprints. Every week brought new letters, some filled with gratitude, some with plans, all with the same pulse of renewal. I kept them in an oak chest by the window, tied with blue ribbon. I called it the Archive of Voices. On a cold morning in November, Isla came running up the path, her cheeks flushed with wind. She was holding a letter, the edges creased as if it had traveled far. "It's from Marseille," she said, breathless, "from the engineer you funded last year." I took the letter and unfolded it. The first line read, "The houses are standing. The tide came and they stood." There was a photograph tucked inside, a row of small white homes along the coast, their foundations rooted deep in the rock, their walls reflecting the same pale sunlight that shone on our own sea. I traced the image with my thumb. Those houses had been sketches once, lines on a forgotten draft. Now they were real, lived in, laughing. "Do you see?" Isla said softly. She named the design the Harrington frame. I smiled. "Then the circle is closing." That evening, as the last light faded over the garden, I found myself thinking of Harold again. I could almost hear him pacing through the halls, explaining some structural equation with too much excitement or tapping the piano keys just to test if I was listening. I missed his noise sometimes, not the arguments or the ambition, but the faith that everything we built mattered. I went to the study and opened the drawer that held the old compass brooch. The metal had tarnished, but the needle still moved. It pointed toward the sea, unwavering like it always had. I pinned it to my blouse and whispered, "All right then, let's see where home takes us next." Later that night, the wind picked up. The sea's voice carried through the house, low and constant. I lit a single candle and returned to my desk. On the first page of a new notebook, I wrote, "The world will always remember the loud ones." My task was to make space for the quiet ones, to prove that silence, when chosen, can build empires that never collapse. As I wrote, a soft knock came from the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, a young woman stood there, dark coat, messy hair, a stack of folders clutched to her chest. Her eyes were nervous but determined. "Mrs. Harrington?" she asked. "Yes. I'm sorry to come without calling. I'm an architecture student. I was told you sometimes mentor people who need a second chance." I stepped aside. "Then you've come to the right place." She hesitated, then entered. Her hands trembled as she set her work on the table, sketches of modular shelters, notes scrawled in margins. I recognized the precision of someone who loved an idea enough to fear losing it. "These are good," I said after a while. "You understand how space breathes. That's rare." "I just don't have the degree yet," she said quietly, "and no one takes me seriously without one." I looked up. They didn't take me seriously either, not at first. Sometimes the world needs to see what you've built before it learns your name. She blinked hard, trying not to cry. "You'd really help me," I smiled. "Help you? No, but I'll walk beside you until you help yourself." Her shoulders relaxed, the first sign of hope taking root. She looked around the house, the piano, the sea framed by the windows. "It's beautiful here," she whispered. "It wasn't always," I said, "but beauty is what remains when truth finishes its work." We spent the evening going through her drawings. By the time she left, the moon had risen high and white above the water. When the door closed, I stood for a moment in the quiet and felt something shift, not nostalgia, not pride, but continuity. The story hadn't ended. It had simply found new hands to hold it. Before going to bed, I sat at the piano and began to play the melody called Inheritance. I added a few notes of my own, a variation that bent the tune toward something lighter. As the last chord faded, I thought, every design needs revision, even the ones built from love. I looked around the room, the same walls, the same air, yet everything was different. The house no longer carried the past like a burden. It carried it like a promise. And when I finally turned off the lamp, the darkness didn't feel like absence. It felt like rest, the kind you earn, the kind that waits before becoming dawn. Morning returned wrapped in silver mist, the kind that blurs the distance between the sea and the sky until both seem to breathe as one. I woke to the sound of gulls circling the coast and the faint tapping of rain against the window panes. The air carried a softness that only comes after years of noise, a silence so complete it feels alive. Downstairs, the house waited as it always did, steady, faithful, listening. The piano reflected the pale light. On the counter, yesterday's cup still held a ring of tea at the bottom, as if time itself had stopped for a moment to watch. I poured a fresh cup, added honey, and carried it to the window seat overlooking the garden. The young woman, her name was Alina, had left a note on the table before she went home last night. I unfolded it, the ink smudged at the edges. "Thank you for listening. I think I can do it now, not because I believe in myself, but because I believe in the kind of world you're building." The handwriting was uncertain but determined. I smiled. Every generation begins this way, one trembling line at a time. The roses outside were heavy with dew. The garden had grown wild again, but it was the kind of wildness that belonged, vines weaving through trellises, branches finding new angles of sunlight. I had learned that control was never the opposite of chaos. Sometimes they built each other. I thought of Harold then, not as a ghost, but as a presence spread through the house, in the ticking clock, the faint echo of laughter in the stairs, the steady rhythm of my own breathing. He was here not because memory demanded it, but because love had nowhere else to go. At 9, Isla arrived with a folder full of updates. She spoke with the effortless confidence I had once only pretended to have. "The second round of grants is confirmed," she said, flipping through the pages. "The Harrington frame design has been adopted in 3 coastal towns, and the Italian composer sent word her symphony, Inheritance, will premiere next spring." "That's fast," I said. "She dedicated it to you." I looked down at the floor, letting the warmth of that simple sentence settle in. Then I'll have to learn how to listen without flinching. We laughed. The kind of laughter that doesn't need to fill silence, it simply rests inside it. After Isla left, I decided to walk down to the harbor. The air was cool and clear, the kind of morning that feels like forgiveness. Fishermen called to one another, their voices sharp against the wind. A child chased a seagull down the boardwalk. Everything shimmered with ordinary life, and for once, that felt extraordinary. I sat on a bench overlooking the water and watched the tide roll in. Somewhere beneath those waves, the weight of years had already dissolved arguments, regrets, the ache of what-ifs. All that remained was movement. From my coat pocket, I pulled the compass brooch. Its needle quivered, pointing as it always did toward home. But this time I understood, home wasn't the house or even the legacy. It was motion itself, the forward step, the unfinished note. I held it tight in my palm and whispered, "Thank you for never breaking." By the time I returned, the fog had begun to lift. Sunlight poured through the windows in gentle gold bands, warming the floors, touching every familiar corner as if reintroducing itself. I opened all the doors and let it in. The house, this old faithful vessel of memory, seemed to sigh in relief. On the piano lay the sheet music for inheritance. I sat, pressed my hands to the keys, and began to play. The melody filled the room, the same theme that had followed me through so many versions of myself: wife, mother, widow, architect, survivor, founder. The notes rose and fell like breath, until they no longer belonged to me alone. When the last chord settled, I didn't close the lid. I left it open. The sound lingered long after, floating up the stairs, through the hall, out into the garden as if searching for a place to rest. I returned to the desk one final time and opened my journal. On the last page, I wrote slowly, carefully, each word cert. Legacy is not the echo of a name. It's the resonance of an act repeated in other hands. I built structures. They built hope. And somewhere between the two, I became whole. I laid down the pen and looked out the window. The horizon was clear now, a perfect seam of blue stitched to the world. For the first time, I didn't wonder what came next. I simply breathed. The house stood behind me, the sea before me, and in between, in that perfect, fleeting stillness, everything I had ever built finally felt alive. And that was the end and the beginning all at once.